Alright, so what I'm going to try to do is in this video, I'm going to try to get my final light mapping render complete. It's going to take a couple of test renders. This could take a while. Test rendering with Beast is a time-consuming process. Okay, depending on how fast your machine is, your workstation could be a little bit faster of a process, or it could take a little bit longer. So let's go ahead and get this done. Now, in order to bake the entire scene, I'm not going to select individual objects and hit bake selected. I'm going to start hitting the bake button because that'll bake everything. But before I do that, I want to set everything at sort of preview settings, low quality Beast settings. That way I can render it as fast as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to probably set, I'm going to leave the quality at high, but I'm going to change some of these settings. So the final gather race, that's the biggest parameter that's going to determine how fast or how slow you render. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go for about 32 rays, which is very, very low. Okay. And what I'm going to do also is I'll probably turn on ambient occlusion. And what I want to do is I want to turn on ambient occlusion all the way. And I can actually do a couple of tests so you can see the difference between ambient occlusion and not ambient occlusion. Okay. The resolution, I'm going to leave this maybe at 10, maybe even I'll go to something like 5. So that renders out much, much faster. Okay. Okay, so here's my entire scene. A cool trick here that I want to show you. Here is how to control light mapping. How to basically have something contribute to light mapping but not use up your light map. Okay. So if I come outside, for example, if you look at the rooftop over here, you notice that the rooftop has light mapping enabled. Obviously, if I select it, it's set as a static object, and of course you can see the checkerboard texture right there overlaid on top of it. That quickly tells you that that's contributing to light mapping. However, in this particular level, the player will never be on the roof, so there's no point on wasting my light mapping on the roof. So if I go ahead and take this object and deselect it as a static object, because it's not contributing to the light mapping, what's going to happen is the lighting from the sky is going to go through it like if it was invisible, and it's going to go into my warehouse, which is going to make my warehouse look completely wrong. It's going to look bad. Okay, so what I need is for the roof over here to contribute to light mapping but not use up my light map. Okay, so how can I do that? Well, it's pretty simple. Let me turn that back to static. Over here in the scale and light map setting, it's set to 1 right now. What I can do is set that to 0. By setting it to 0, basically what you're telling Beast is, this rooftop, I want it to block out light and contribute to the light mapping process, but I do not want it to take up any space on the actual light map itself. Okay, so I get to kind of have my cake and eat it too. So the trick is, go around to any objects in your scene that are not important for light mapping, okay, that should be considered when the light mapping calculations are made, but shouldn't use up the light map at all. So you set the scale to 0, and then those objects won't mess around with the light mapping at all. So basically those objects right there. If there's any other objects in my scene that I don't want to contribute to light mapping, I can do that as well. Okay. Now let me turn off the show resolution option here. Now these mounds of dirt and debris, they look kind of weird. You've probably noticed for a while now, for a few videos, that they look kind of strange, almost like they're glowing. Okay. This is kind of, it's not a bug in Unity. It's kind of done by design, but it's not something good. Basically, in Unity, let me close this actually, the light mapping window. The transparent shaders don't work with shadows. In other words, they don't receive shadows. So the sunlight is going through everything in my scene and hitting these mounds of dirt inside. That's why they look so weird, almost like they're glowing, because the shadows being cast by the ceiling, the roof, and all that stuff isn't having any effect on these things, and that is obviously not good. So a way around that, I guess, is if you program your own transparent shader. Now, so I'm not going to try and do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find a workaround for this, and the workaround I'm going to use is using the cutout shaders. If I go over here to the shader drop-down list, you notice that I have transparent shaders. I don't want to use any of the transparent shaders. I want to use the cutout shaders. So I'm going to use the cutout bump diffuse. And now you can see that the shadows work perfectly. Okay, I still get sort of this transparent edge right here, which looks pretty decent. Doesn't look as good as the regular transparent shader, but unfortunately there's nothing I can do about that. I would rather have these objects have shadows and things like that and look good. So I'm going to go over here to transparent, and I'm going to switch this over to a cutout, bump diffuse. There we go, that looks good. Okay, so now it starts to look more normal. Now, these objects here, same thing. I'm going to go to transparent, cutout, bump diffuse. So now you can see that they accept shadows and work a lot better. This obviously looks much better than before. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take these objects here, okay, and I'm going to go to the mesh renderer component over here, and I'm going to tell it to not cast shadows. I don't want these objects casting shadows in my scene because that doesn't look good. I'm going to do the same for this object over here. So, not cast shadows. Okay, so these mounds of dirt, and I'm going to go to this one as well over here. I'm going to tell that one to not cast shadows as well. Another thing that I'm going to do, and this is just going to help out the light mapping here, I'm going to take this object here, and I'm going to go to its alpha cutoff, and I'm going to reduce the alpha cutoff, or increase it, I should say. Increase it all the way up. Let me take off lighting in the scene. I'm also going to go to some of these wall decals over here. I'm going to take the alpha cutoff, and I'm going to increase that all the way as well. So you don't have to do this, but it's going to help reduce any artifacting that's going to happen because of the Beast Light Mapper with these things. And you'll see what I mean later when I finish light mapping. So I'm going to say I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to take this guy here and do the same thing. Take the alpha cutoff, set it to 0, or increase it all the way up. Okay, so I'm going to say I'm happy with that. Let me turn my lighting back on. Make sure you're constantly saving while you're working in any program, including Unity. So I'm done with that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a test render of the entire scene. So let me see here. Let me turn on the light mapping window over here. I'm going to turn on show resolution. What I'm going to do is, let me see if I want to take these window panels here. Let me actually reduce that to maybe something like 0.1. Another thing I want to do is, and I'll show you this through test renders, if I select those window panels and I go to the shader settings, remember this self-illumination diffuse shader? It's got this emission light mapper parameter here, which is set to 0 right now. I'm going to leave it at 0, and I'm going to show you what that parameter does. I'm going to say that I'm happy with the entire scene here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my light mapping parameters, and I'm going to start to play around with this. So I'm going to go to the bake settings. Final gather rate should be set at something like 32, pretty low. Ambient occlusion I'm going to leave off at the moment. I'm going to say I'm happy with everything for now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit bake. Not bake selected, I'm going to hit bake. What that's going to do, it's going to bake out the entire scene. Now at this point, baking out the entire scene is going to take a good amount of time. So don't be surprised if it takes maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, maybe more, depending on your system and the complexity of your map. So I'm going to bake this out. I'm going to stop the video, and then I'm going to continue it when it's done baking, so you don't have to watch this process for half an hour or whatnot. So I'm going to go ahead and hit bake. I'm going to bake this, let it finish up, and then I'll be back when it's done. So finished rendering. You can see here that the stats over here tell me the last bake took 5 minutes 15 seconds, which honestly wasn't that bad. And that's why we want to reduce the final gather rates to something like 32. That 5 minutes could easily turn into an hour or an hour and a half. So let me move this a little bit out of the way. Let's have a look at our scene here. So it might be a little bit hard to see with the little checkerboard overlay on top, so we can turn that show resolution option off. And you can see what the scene looks like. We have very beautiful lighting kind of bouncing off the sky and from the sun, bouncing off the floor and stuff. Looks pretty cool. If I turn off light maps, this is the way it looked before. This is the way it looks after. See that? Big, big difference. Okay? We come inside the actual warehouse here. Again, I can turn off the light maps and I can turn it on. And this is good not just to show you the before and after, but so you can troubleshoot. So if you see that some lights are too bright or something like that, you can fix it. You can come in here, see what the before and after looks like. We can see the ceiling here of the warehouse, check out some of the details, see how it looks. And just constantly check out before and after, and this will allow you to tweak it. Usually you won't get the best results right away. Usually you'll have to do some test rendering first and do a lot of testing, just back and forth testing, just so that you can get this stuff looking good. And this is a good time to look at this test render, look at your scene, and see which areas may need to be darkened or brightened, things like that. Take a moment to do that. I'm going to make a few changes here. One of the changes that I'm going to make is I'm going to take the sunlight, which is right there. Now, this is something that's really cool inside of Unity with Beast. You can actually set the bounce settings on individual lights independently of each other. Okay, so over here in the main bake settings, we have the ability to control bounces. Okay, well, we can go to individual lights and change parameters there. If I go to the sunlight, for example, and I look inside the inspector, I don't have many controls for light mapping. But if I go to the light mapping window and I have the light selected and I go to the object view, you can see that I have options here that were kind of hidden before, but these options will allow me to control the way that this light works with the light mapping. Okay, so for example, here's the intensity, which is 0.75. That's what I had set up in Unity a long time ago, earlier on in this tutorial. I'm going to leave that alone, but I have the ability to control the bounce intensity. So if I want the bounce intensity to be a little bit brighter for the sunlight, which I probably do, I can increase this to say 1.5, and now I'll get myself a little bit of a stronger bounce lighting there from the sun, okay, without affecting everything else in the scene. So just the sunlight will have stronger bounce intensity, which can be pretty useful. So what I'm going to do is, if I can come to this inside the scene here, right? And I can look at this and I can say, well, I want certain areas to have stronger bounce lighting than other ones. So for example, I could take this light right here. The bounce intensity right now is set to 1. If for whatever reason I felt like this light needed to fill in the area a little bit more, I can increase that bounce intensity a little bit more. What I'm going to do is I'm going to darken up my scene. I'm going to use ambient occlusion. I'm going to go to the bake settings. I'm going to activate ambient occlusion. I'm going to set it all the way up to 1. The max distance is actually very, very important. If you're familiar with renderers like Mental Ray and you've worked with ambient occlusion before in a professional setting, then you probably already understand how max distance works. If that's the case, this works exactly the same as in Mental Ray. Okay, so the max distance with ambient occlusion and the contrast works exactly the same. If you're not familiar with Mental Ray, then I'm here to take you by the hand and show you this stuff and teach you what it does. The more ambient occlusion effect you have, the more ambient occlusion effect you have in your scene. Now the max distance here, this is going to control how far the ambient occlusion effect goes. Okay, so the ambient occlusion effect basically samples the surface of an object, and it calculates based on this max distance. So for example, if I come out here to the corner right here where these two walls meet, right here in this spot, if I have ambient occlusion set to a really big distance, this will become very, very dark. The darkening will spread out a lot more from that corner. If I have the max distance set very, very low, like 0.1 for example, then the ambient occlusion effect is not going to reach very, very far. Okay, so I can show you very quickly how this works by simply selecting some of these objects. So I'll select, for example, maybe these walls right here. And actually, maybe I'll show you the effect over here. Let me select this wall. I'm going to select this ceiling over here and this wall right here. I'm going to select these facades. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have ambient occlusion turned on. The max distance I'll leave at 0.1. The contrast I'm going to leave at 1. And I'm going to go ahead and I think I'm just going to bake that. Okay, so let me just bake this. So I'm going to go to Bake Selected. And you can see here if I zoom in a little bit, there's a little bit of ambient occlusion there. It might be a little bit hard to see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take maybe this contrast and drop it down to maybe like 0.5. And the max distance, I'm actually going to, let me increase that to something like maybe 10. So it just reaches a little bit more. And just look at the way that this looks right now. I'm going to go ahead and Bake Selected. And now we can see clearly that that area got darkened up thanks to the ambient occlusion. So that's what ambient occlusion does. It takes contact areas and it basically just darkens them up. Okay, so ambient occlusion is there for you to use if you want. I'm going to go ahead and use it. I like using ambient occlusion. It adds a nice bit of depth to the lighting in my scene, so I'm going to use it. One last thing that I'm going to show you over here is the emission settings. If I select this object here, let me move this window out of the way. Remember this emission light mapper setting? It's set to 0 by default. Okay, let me show you what this does. I'm going to select the window pane up there, and I'm going to go ahead and maybe select also the air ducts that are right there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bake just those selected objects. Okay, so it finished. Okay, so this is the way it looks right now. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that material. So I'm going to select the window pane here, and I'm going to take that emission parameter and I'm going to crank that up to something pretty high, something like 50. And I'm going to take those same objects, so the window panels and the air ducts over here, just so you can see how this works. I'm going to hit bake selected. So it finished. Now you can clearly see there's a huge difference. Basically, what the parameter does inside of this material here, the emission parameter for the light mapper, when I cranked it up to 50, what it did was that Beast took that into account and used that to basically create lighting based on that shader or that material. So you can see that the lighting actually affects the air ducts over here. So that can actually help to create more realistic, believable lighting, like there's this bright lighting coming in down from the sun through those windows, and it's kind of brightening up that area right there. So that can be pretty useful, and it's actually something that I want to do. So you can control light mapping not just through Beast Light Mapper, but also through certain materials like the self-illuminating material right here, or the self-illumination material. So I'm going to use this parameter. I'm going to crank it down to something like maybe 25, so half that. I don't want to go too crazy with it. Let me do a test render to see how it looks. Okay, finished. And this is what it looks like. The lighting is a little bit better. It's not overly bright, but it still brightens up that area right there. Makes it just a little bit more believable that there's this kind of light coming in from that skylight window, which tends to look pretty cool. Okay, so that's how you can use that emission parameter in the self-illuminating shader. Alright, so I'm going to say I'm happy with that. I'm going to end this video here. I'm going to do another test render. I'm going to do another test render for the entire scene, so I'm not going to bake select, and I'm going to bake everything. And this time I'm going to do it with the ambient occlusion on, just to see what the effect is. So make sure to keep those final gather rays pretty low. Do another test render. It should take on my machine about 5 minutes. That's how long it took the other one, the previous test render. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to end this video, and in the next one we're going to continue with Beast and start to fine-tune this scene and get it to look good.